Okay, well, we'd like to welcome everybody in Ontario in particular, and if there's others from outside of Ontario who have joined us, you're more than welcome. We're happy to have you. Although we did say that this was kind of specific to the Ontario context, but I would imagine that there'll be things that we talk about that will be helpful for many others. We're grateful that you could join us, and we're excited to be able to provide this webinar, and we're excited for the folks that we have on. And we're anxious to get rolling and talk about what we're going to talk about today. So the webinar today was focused on eviction prevention in the Ontario context, what you need to know and consider. And as I said, I think we're going to have some great insight and information available to folks. My name is Wally Check. I'm the Director of Training with the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. And I'm going to be your host for today's webinar. I'm going to primarily be a facilitator, and we'll let all the hard work and all the important stuff happen with the folks on the panel. Our mission at the Canadian Alliance is very simple, but in our minds very powerful, and that's to lead a national movement of individuals and organizations and communities working together to end homelessness in Canada. Just a tiny bit about the Canadian Alliance. We continue to grow and spread our wings. And what you see here is the different facets of the Canadian Alliance. Of course, we have the conference, which I think many on the webinar today have been a part of, or at the very least been privy to. Sadly, our conference this year, due to COVID and like many other things, had to be canceled. But you see that there's new dates set for revisiting that conference. We've got Built for Zero Canada, which is a very focused and intensive national change effort around ending homelessness, focused specifically on coordinated access and by name lists. Then there's the training and technical assistance again, which is my program. And we have our allied networks, which actually one of our panelists today is a huge part and key member of one of those allied networks and part of the Canadian Alliance. And then, of course, we have our advocacy efforts, which, I think that this technically falls under that as well. But to see any more information about any of those, feel free to go to the Canadian Alliance website, and you will be able to go into each of those and get some additional information. We do want to highlight that our ability to do this webinar and many of the others that we do is due in part by funding from the federal government of Canada. Specifically through the Reaching Home aspect of the federal government or of the community capacity and innovation funding. So we're grateful to them and grateful for our partnership there and for the things that we can do because of that relationship. So this is sort of a hybrid today of a webinar and community of practice call, because we are encouraging participation. And I'll talk about that in a little bit, but we are planning for approximately an hour of time for this webinar. And, we'll be letting you know about how to participate and get involved. So this is one of the key things that I wanted to mention, that there is a Q&A function that you will see on your screen. We would ask that if you have questions or comments that you would like to be brought out, that you would do that through the Q&A function. If you just want to make general comments to other people who might be participants or listening, feel free to do that in the chat. But questions specific to our panelists and comments that are really important that you feel need to be expressed outwardly in the webinar, then do that through the Q&A. It helps us to keep things organized and structured in a way that we don't get lost in having to bounce back and forth between the chat and the Q&A feature. And as it says here below as well, we may or may not have the opportunity to unmute folks so that you can speak to your questions, just depending on the time. But if you would, when you ask a question, just indicate by putting a yes in quotation marks at the end of your question. That lets us know if you're open to speaking publicly. And then if we can, we'll unmute you and we'll involve you that way. So just to look quickly at our agenda, I'm going to go through a quick introduction of the topic and our panelists. And then we'll go from there, and each of our panelists is going to provide a brief sort of overview of this issue from their perspective, from the work that they do. And then at that point, we'll move into, ongoing discussion in terms of where that takes us, looking at the questions that are being asked and other comments that the panelists have about things that they each have to say. In the end, we'll try to provide a bit of a summary, and then we'll close off the webinar. And as I said, this webinar will be recorded, so you will have access to it later on. You will have access to it in 2 locations. One will be through the Training and Technical Assistance website under our webinar menu item, as well as this is also tied in a little bit to our COVID-19 efforts. And so through a partnership we have with CNH3, and again, I'll give you these websites at the end. We have a website set up where we have resources, including links to webinars that we've done that will be available there. And any resources that we discuss that can be shared, we'll also make those available either through the chat, or they will be connected to where you will find the recording of this webinar afterwards. And we will likely have the recording of the webinar available by the end of the day today or tomorrow morning. So you'll be able to find it fairly quickly. So if you've got folks who couldn't join or you'd like to review it, then it should be available. So without wasting any more time, I want to introduce our panelists really quickly. First of all, we have Lisa Med, who has been with CMHA in Ottawa for over 17 years and has been a big part of the housing management department, and it currently is heading up an eviction prevention program in Ottawa. And Lisa was also, or has also been instrumental in all of the efforts regarding the implementation of Housing First through CMHA in Ottawa, and she has taken great pride in building those programs out with fidelity to the model of Housing First. So welcome, Lisa. She's waving at you. Next, we have Annie Hodgins. So Annie is the operations manager at the Center for Equality Rights and Accommodation, or CERA, and she oversees the delivery of policy initiatives, projects, services, and communications, and contributes to strategy, program development, and resourcing initiatives with CERA. So thanks for joining us, Annie, and welcome to the webinar. Following that, we have Mr. Ken Hale, who is the Director of Advocacy and Legal Services with the Advocacy Centre for Tenants in Ontario, or ACTO. Ken has been involved in many legal efforts, particularly support on charter challenges in Ontario's courts and submission on housing rights in Canada to the UN Committee in Geneva, and has participated in the Government of Canada's National Consultation on Human Rights and Housing, among other things. So thanks, Ken, for joining us as well. We appreciate having you. And last but not least, we've got on our panel Michelle Biss, who is, as I said, our own CAEH project manager of the National Right to Housing Network. And Michelle is an expert in economic and social rights and has presented at several United Nations treaty body reviews, as well as Canadian parliamentary committees related to poverty, again, among other things. So thanks, Michelle. Appreciate you joining us and helping in organizing this webinar with us. So with that being said, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we can make sure that we see all these people bright and clear. And I just wanted to start off maybe with Lisa. If Lisa, you could just share with us, I know you've done a lot of work on the ground and you've been directly involved with folks both through Housing First and through this new eviction prevention program, and in dealing with the issues that relate to eviction and the problems that come up with that. I wonder if you could just start by giving us a bit of an update about where you see things from your perspective and some things that you think are important to consider from your end.
Yes, thanks Wally, and thanks for inviting me to be a part of this, and thanks for that very very nice introduction, which I did not write. So I wanted to give some context. So CMHA Ottawa serves about 1,000 folks a year that have serious and persistent mental illness. We're direct community-based mental health services, and a lot of the folks we're working with have concurrent disorders, so are also experiencing serious addictions issues. And most of the folks that come to our services in the beginning are homeless. So I wanted to put this into context of Housing First, because Housing First has been a service delivery way that we've operated since essentially the advent of our direct client services, which is well over 20 years. We have got fidelity to the Pathways Housing First model. And I just want to remind folks that with the Housing First model, because the idea is that people do not have to be housing ready when they're looking for housing, that people are not coming into their housing abstinent or necessarily following any mental health treatment regime, but they are being surrounded by intensive case management supports in our agency's role with doing Housing First. And the idea is that recovery kind of then happens from that. But we know that sometimes it doesn't work the first time, or sometimes even the second time, and sometimes it does take a couple tries. So we are definitely supporting people through evictions every now and then and into rapid rehousing. So that is a part of the function as well. We also wear a hat of a landlord. So we own condos. We have 40 scattered site condos. And so we do play both a landlord, but we have many, many partnerships. We're running over 400 rent subs with primarily private market landlords. And those are rent subs funded through the Ministry of Health. So we have a very, we have a lot of role in supporting landlords so that they'll be a part of our program. So and then as Wally had said, very recently, the City of Ottawa, almost a year now, the city had given us some funding for a small eviction prevention program, one staff, that is targeted specifically with very small nonprofit and co-op housing sector providers. And that program is kind of really getting off the ground. There hasn't been as much uptake as one would hope, but eviction prevention has been a part of our services in many ways all along. So I'm going to touch on just a few things that we've seen over the last few months about housing people, and then tenancy issues that we're seeing in people's housing. So during these COVID months, we did get people housed. We were successful. We did some very proactive outreach with landlords. I think some landlords were happy to know that tenants would come with guaranteed rents, that things were becoming economically unstable. And so we were able to house a number of people over these last few months. But that doesn't mean that our clients overall are not facing discrimination and other barriers to accessing housing, but we have done some proactive work with landlords and have got people housed. But things have not been, totally great in people's housing. The situation, people have, like in this COVID situation, isolation has become a big thing. People have lost their supports. And mental wellness has certainly taken a hit, as well as addiction. So we're definitely seeing an increase in drug activity, noise complaints, tenant-to-tenant conflict, messy and damaged units, unwanted guests, and home takeovers. That's happening. And when this all happened, the mental health supports in the community, our services were not going out into seeing people in their units, along with many other types of services that people may receive to support them in their housing. So there's a lot of work that we're back in and seeing people on a more regular basis, again, with lots of precautions and lots of considerations before we're getting into people's units. But there's a lot of work to be done now to re-engage with folks and really help people get back on track and stabilize. And even going into this time period, in particular, like in our eviction prevention program, one of the big challenges is hoarding related issues, pest infestations with hoarding. And, we had been making some headway with some clients, which is it's a challenging thing to work on. And, And I think, we've probably lost momentum and are going to be kind of starting again on these things. One of the ones I know that we were working on, the eviction was stayed and the landlord didn't follow up. So at this point, the one kind of critical situation is kind of just staying put. And I don't know if the tenant himself is quite as motivated now that things are kind of stabilized. The other thing that's been going on is related to, with the isolation, people are wanting to see people, and there have been guests that have come and stayed, and sometimes those guests won't go. So we've got problems with guests being disruptive. We've got home takeovers that are happening. And we've noticed that the police interventions in some cases don't seem to be as willing to intervene with some of the home takeover stuff. And I'm not sure if it's just kind of coincidental, or if there is a real element of, the COVID stuff and just not getting that involved in that type of intervention. And at the same time, we've had clients who've actually left their units. They've gone to stay, maybe care for family or friends somewhere else. But in doing that, they may have also handed the keys over to somebody else to stay in their unit. And as a landlord, we actually are dealing with a situation right now where we've got occupants in a unit that don't belong there. So we're having to deal with that. The CERB has had some impact, as people have probably heard and have maybe been seeing, but it's been putting people's housing at risk when it's been associated with increased substance use. Some people have gotten access to CERB and have used it for substances, and that's not only putting people's housing at risk, but as you know, people's lives have been put at risk in many cases for that. So that's been challenging. And then for folks whose ODSP or OW workers find out that they've got the CERB, their rents have been stopped, like their benefits have been stopped, the rent directs haven't happened, and we've got some clients that are in arrears. And then in social housing, one of the ongoing challenges is the kind of making sure you've got all the documentation up to date and not losing your subsidy or benefit because of having your paperwork up to date. And so we've had some kind of relaxation on deadlines for that, but it's not, it's not kind of across the board, and it's not really clear what that's looking like. And then of course there's been a lack of income tax clinics to support people to do the work that they need to do to support them to maintain those benefits. So there's been all types of pressures and kind of an increased sense of risk of people's tenancy. But at the same time, we really haven't seen, and this is within our population, haven't seen an increased number of N4s, N5s, N7s being issued. And, that could be for a couple of different reasons. It could be landlords just are not kind of deciding to follow through as things are feeling kind of shut down. Also, we know that in some of the properties that, they haven't had full staff on site, and there just aren't people to do the work that maybe they would normally be doing in those cases. So, so that's kind of what we've been seeing. We do anticipate that, because of all these challenges, that landlords may start a kind of a wave of evictions once things are clearly kind of opening back up, and that's what, we kind of have to prepare for, I guess.
Sorry, I was muted. Thanks, Lisa. Great overview, and I think it tells us a little bit about the idea that there's two sides to the coin, right? And there's things that have to be considered in both, both sides, whether it's landlords and the problems that they're facing versus tenants and the challenges that they're facing when it comes to their rights and so forth. And so I think you drew kind of a nice overview picture of what is happening on the ground out there. So I appreciate that. So Annie, if we could jump to you now for a few minutes, and I know you are often brought in to help in working with individuals who are facing challenges and are kind of then working directly with housing participants and maybe even organizations that are supporting those participants. And so in light of all of that, and maybe even in light of some of the things that Lisa brought up, how would you portray the picture from your perspective?
Yeah, thanks, Wally. So I'll just do a really brief sort of intro to what CIRA does, and then I'll dive into our services and what we've heard from tenants facing eviction over the past few months. So CIRA does sort of three buckets of work. We do policy reform and legal reform initiatives. We do community education, so we educate both community members and landlords and community service workers on sort of eviction prevention and the human right to housing and the Ontario Human Rights Code and how that applies to tenants' rights and housing. And then a really important third sort of area of work where I've worked with us for 6 years is doing direct services for tenants. And our direct services are funded by the City of Toronto, and we provide them to over 1,000 tenants a year. And it's two main areas. One is eviction prevention, and then the other is the Ontario Human Rights Code and how that applies to housing. And sometimes obviously those two intersect, especially as Lisa sort of outlined, there's often other aspects to a situation when someone's about to lose their home. So we do provide sort of eviction prevention strategies, education about the law, and then a lot of the work we do on eviction prevention is helping people navigate the landlord and tenant board process, helping them navigate the forms they're receiving. It's a complicated process, and a lot of the people that call us are in a lot of sort of financial need. There might be other issues happening, and they don't necessarily, they're not in the best position to navigate that process, and they're not able to access, often the people that contact us aren't able to access Legal Aid Ontario clinics. Maybe their income is past the cutoff. Maybe they're just not able to, so they need to sort of navigate the process themselves. So we try to provide that support in general. Under normal circumstances, that's sort of what we do. And then what we've been seeing since COVID started is similar to what we normally see. However, we have had an increase in inquiries about eviction, and a lot of it has to do with people being very fearful about losing their home. So we've even had sort of just general inquiries about what happens if I'm not able to pay my rent. We've had a lot of inquiries about how do I access the CERB. We've had people saying, I'm receiving CERB and I can't afford my rent. That's a big one. And then we've also had, so a lot of worry and stress that's being sort of just preemptively, maybe they haven't received a form yet from the landlord and tenant board about eviction. They may not have even received a letter from their landlord, or their landlord may not have reached out, but they're just anticipating, I've lost my job and I'm not sure what I can do. Another thing we've seen is landlords speaking with tenants, and I know that, you know, there's great landlords out there. We generally hear when there's a problem, so we are hearing that some landlords are not taking the advice that the Premier a while ago said, you know, work something out, which, you know, that's without really anything to back it up, and not every landlord is trying to work it out. So landlords asking tenants, are you going to be able to pay rent? Pressuring tenants to pay rent, threatening tenants with eviction. There's nothing really stopping landlords from issuing notices of eviction, so they can't take the process further. But so the threats of eviction are still happening, and people are still sort of being given, you know, messaging or forms that are saying when the moratorium is lifted, you know, unless you pay your rent, I'm going to move forward with eviction. So just a lot of worry about people losing their jobs and not having the financial resources to meet their obligations to pay rent. And that's not necessarily different from what we hear otherwise, but it's been sort of increased. And there's just a lot of worry. And we've even had people call us and say, what are the rules around this? What are the actual policies around this? And looking for more certainty than they've been provided so far. So, and just not necessarily directly eviction related, but landlords wanting to enter units during COVID was another big thing that came up. If they want to sort of sell a home, or someone has given, we had a couple of people give notice prior to COVID, and then they wanted to know, do I still need to move during COVID? What can I do if my landlord needs to enter the unit because I don't feel comfortable with that? So those are that's sort of a snapshot of what we've been hearing.
Yeah, so it sounds like just a lot of anxiety, a lot of worry and stress about what's happening, and people kind of preparing themselves for the worst, it sounds like, and assuming it's going to be the worst.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Perfect. Well, I think there's a few things there that we'll want to come back to and dig a little deeper into, but I want to jump to Ken. And, Ken, you've been working in a large part in kind of that higher level policy and advocacy picture in all of this. And you probably are hearing some similar things to what Annie is talking about. And we're trying to address those on different levels. But tell us kind of what your thoughts are.
Well, thanks, Wally, and thanks for the opportunity to join this presentation. ACTO has two major parts. Kind of the ACTO part is the sort of advocacy and policy part, and we also manage the Tenant Duty Council program at the Landlord and Tenant Board. And just to talk about that second part for a minute, we've had to the Landlord and Tenant Board still is in operation, but the number of hearings is drastically reduced, and those hearings are being done by telephone. And they're restricted to cases that aren't about eviction or particular emergency type, serious health concern type evictions. So we had to throw together very quickly a Tenant Duty Council program to provide help for people in those telephone hearings. So that's kind of where we're hearing our frontline stories, such as Annie's and a lot of those problems. But I didn't, and yeah, that's something that took a lot of work and is going, I think the whole hearing process, as I'll get to, is probably going to change. And some of this experience that we've had in throwing this together has been really good for us in trying to figure out a way to provide service to people in an environment where an in-person hearing isn't going to be necessarily the standard anymore. But from the sort of policy point of view, I mean, we continue to try to support the right to housing, and how do we actually make the right to housing work? And, we see really the basis of all housing rights as protection from eviction. A secure tenancy, if you don't have a secure tenancy, if you don't feel that you're going to be there next week or next month or next year, you don't really have anything, and you suffer from that insecurity that Annie was talking about. And I think that's really particularly been brought home to the whole world during the COVID crisis, and the importance of staying in place, and putting aside the concerns that the government, I thought, made a very smart decision to clearly say, we're not going to allow evictions of tenants, of homeowners, of anybody during this period, because we want you to stay home and not infect people. And we managed to go from March to July with a tiny, not even a trickle really, of evictions, and somehow the world has kept turning and the economy has been limping along. And I really hope that there's some lessons there, that we don't necessarily need to use the hammer for every single dispute in our in the landlord and tenant world. But to really have protection from eviction, we would need a very different housing market and a very different economy. We'd need to have an adequate supply of good housing everywhere where people are across the country. We need to have stable incomes for everybody, so that make sure those payments are made. We'd have to have provisions for emergencies because we know emergencies, small and large, are going to come along. We would have to have an orderly process of development and change in our communities that actually puts the needs of the residents as high as the needs of promoters and investors. And I think the final piece we really would need is education that actually trains people for community living. And I think that's something we all see lacking in our education system, as good as it is. People don't learn how to be community members. People don't learn how to overcome racism and discrimination. People don't learn constructive ways to resolve disputes. And so those are kind of my, my high-minded ideals of the things that I think we should all be shooting for, but there are intermediate steps to those goals that we recognize as fundamental housing rights for tenants. And the first of those is, good, strong laws that actually protect tenants, that don't allow people to be evicted except for cause, except with notice, don't allow rents to just jump at the whim of the owner, requirements that places be healthy and safe for people, and that if there are disputes, particularly disputes around eviction or displacement, that there's a right to a hearing at a neutral body that can actually listen to both sides and make a decision that is in the best interest of everybody. And that having that accessible dispute resolution system is really, being a legal clinic. That's kind of one of our fundamental goals and where we put a lot of our effort to try to, we moved our eviction process many years ago out of the courts because the courts were too complicated, too formal, into a tribunal that was supposed to be accessible to people. And some of those goals have been accomplished, but I think some people in government and out see these administrative tribunals as a streamlined bargain basement sort of justice. And we think the right of people to keep their homes is too important to have bargain basement justice. So it can be accessible, it can be informal, but it has to be some kind of justice. It can't just be a system where the paperwork gets filed and it's just an inevitable process that the tenant is going to be displaced and forced back out into that difficult market. Other important things are making sure that vital services are regulated and overseen so that people have heat, hydro, the other services that people need to live in a community, including public transit, access to emergency assistance when the emergencies come along, and the land use planning system, the redevelopment process, community development, organizing, people in communities need support to participate in those things and to protect their own interests and to make sure that they and their community members have homes that people can afford. So we see supporting that involvement in that process and development of tenant associations and housing groups and lobby groups and community associations as really a fundamental part of how we cope with the difficulties we're facing, not only now, but in the long run. Immediately, what's been going on, the provincial government, despite kind of shutting down the landlord and tenant board's process and not processing hearings and having very, very few evictions by shutting down the enforcement office, they've still been busy at work kind of reorganizing the system. And there's been a lot of publicity around this Bill 184, changes to the Residential Tenancies Act. We were very involved in that. Tenants across the province, tenant groups, legal groups, individual people showed up for those Zoom legislative hearings and just did an incredibly great job of explaining what the current problems are, what the long-term problems were, why it wasn't good idea. The kind of changes that this bill was proposing were not a good idea. And unfortunately, despite the poignancy of what they were saying and the seriousness of it, the government members just did not listen to one word they said. And it was really, it was callous the way those people were treated, and the fact that there was no acknowledgement of what people were going through. And it was really disappointing when you it sort of seemed that the government had taken on a bit more of a humanitarian cast, and some of the horrible things that had happened in the long-term care homes seemed to have some impact on, wow, maybe we got to be a bit more humanitarian in our approach to people. But when it came to the way they dealt with this bill and the way they dealt with people's concerns, it was very disappointing. So that bill, I think, is going to get its third reading this week. And, truth be told, it doesn't revolutionize the system or anything. It just, it provides a little bit more compensation for tenants who are being displaced for reasons beyond their control. Doesn't do anything to stop the displacement, but maybe discourages a few really blatant cheating and gives some tenants some compensation. But the main thing that it does is try to speed up the process of getting eviction orders against tenants, getting money judgments against tenants. And, two things I think we're not going to need when we go back to normal are more and faster evictions and more debt piled on people. And those are two big things that this bill is going to accomplish through just kind of minor adjustments in the process. But I would like to remind people that this bill does not attack those fundamental things. There's no evictions without just cause. There's opportunities for tenants to sign their rights away that are going to make it easier. But it does involve, if tenants are informed and are committed to working out their problems, to fighting for their homes, those basic rights are there. And, the government did some things to try to deal with the enforcement side of it, which I don't think are, they are going to benefit big landlord organizations who have the systems and the staff to take advantage of this kind of streamlining that's being offered. But, the fundamentals are still there. I should also say, the government has also quickly, in my opinion, kind of rammed through its new legal aid bill. So over the next year, they're going to be completely restructuring legal aid based on what principles or what problems they're trying to address. Not really clear, but much more of a centralized model. I don't know, we'll have to see how it plays out and whether it's going to make a big difference. But there were some real efforts there to cut back on community representation in the legal system and leaving it much more in the hands of professional bureaucrats who, not even necessarily lawyers, who have a commitment to human rights or anything, but a commitment to efficient processes, the repeated theme we hear. So the latest thing is the ending of the moratorium. As far as we can tell, the moratorium will be lifted on the government. Let's just say the government has planned to lift the moratorium at the end of this month and to start having court enforcement officers go out and evict people early in August. Excuse me. Now that is the existing eviction orders that are left over from before March. The Landlord and Tenant Board hasn't opened up to regular hearings yet, and we're still, again, big lack of cooperation and, consultation. Tell people what you're doing, tell them why you're doing it. With this lifting of the moratorium, they snuck into court on July 6th and rewrote the moratorium order, or asked the judge to rewrite the moratorium order, notify anybody. didn't get input from anybody. And so we're looking at whether or not this was the right way to do things, and whether or not there should have been some more process involved before that moratorium got lifted. And things may not proceed as swiftly as the government had hoped. So I'm probably gone on a bit too long, but I really would just like to remind people that the community resources are out there, the legal clinics are out there, the community organizations are out there. We have to rely on tenants. Low-income people are going to need to be more and more informed and more supported in order to keep the pressure off to when the economy starts opening up again. And we all have to commit ourselves to really trying to make our services accessible to people, to find the right resources for people, because there is a lot of goodwill out there, and a lot of levels, and a lot of organizations, and the municipalities, and different community groups, and maybe we can impose some of that on the provincial government's attitude, and get them to see that the way we're going to get through this is a more cooperative and consultative approach, rather than the just relying on a small group of people who have their own interests to be the major decision makers. So I'll leave it at that, and thank you.
Hey, thanks, Ken. Now, Michelle is going to be providing us with sort of a bit of a kind of a federal picture, as well as she's going to have some great information as we continue on here related to multiple aspects of all of this. But before we give Michelle some time, I think that your comment, well, everybody's comments actually provided a great segue into the first question that we have that has come up. And I think it's really kind of one of those things that is probably on most everybody's mind coming into this webinar. And so I'll leave this open really to whoever feels they want to answer. We don't have a buzzer for you to hit, but just give me a hand raise if you feel like you're ready to answer this question. But the question really is, how would you recommend tenants who are in arrears prepare for the eviction process in the context of Bill 184 and the lifting of the eviction moratorium? So people want to know okay, so we've got these problems. People are stressed. People are panicked. People are worried. It's bound to happen, even in light of Lisa's comments that yeah, there hasn't, we haven't had to face a lot of that, but it's very possible we will. So how do people prepare for that if they think it's for sure coming?
I'm happy to take a first sort of stab, and then anyone can complement what I say. This is the type of question that we do get a lot at CIRA. I think, Bill 184 may make some changes to the process, as Ken kind of outlined, but in general, most of the time, people that contact us at least are facing eviction for arrears. So unless there's sort of any additional sort of guidance provided on this in particular, I would say it's the same as general arrears, and there's lots of resources out there to help people. So we actually just released a guide called Eviction Prevention and Navigating the Landlord and Tenant Board for community workers, but I think it's a good resource for anyone, and it kind of gives an outline of the process. What we always advise when it's for arrears is to check what your municipality has available in terms of loans that are available. There are interest-free loans. If you're on social assistance, in different municipalities have programs. In Toronto, it's the Housing Stabilization Fund. So see what funds are available, and then a repayment plan, like a robust, sort of realistic repayment plan is sort of the best way to sort of present yourself when you attend a hearing, and to reach out to get any legal advice available through Legal Aid Ontario or any services like CIRA's Eviction Prevention program. So I would say funds, see what funds are out there, what kind of repayment plan can you come up with, and then can you get legal advice. And Tenant Duty Counsel, as Ken said, is always available in the Landlord and Tenant Board on the day of a hearing. So definitely those are sort of the resources that I'd recommend.
And I'm going to actually just put the link to that guide in the chat, Annie. That's the one you sent us earlier, right? So I'll put that in there. But anybody have any follow-up comments to that?
Well, I think it's just, we don't really know what kind of approach the Landlord and Tenant Board is going to take when it comes down to people whose income has been decimated, you know, and eventually they are called to account. We don't know to what extent that those kind of circumstances are going to be taken in. The Landlord and Tenant Board has the jurisdiction for any eviction for any cause. Their obligation is to balance the circumstances of the parties. And, you know, if we're forcing some sick person out into a hostile housing market because they owe a couple of $100, you know, I really don't believe that that's going to be the way the Landlord and Tenant Board sees its mandate. So keep in mind that you do have the legal right to have your personal circumstances considered by a government appointed adjudicator, no matter how awful your non-payment was. But, you know, also be realistic in, you know, a payment plan that you can live with is probably going to make everybody happy. But a payment plan that you sign saying you're going to pay $500 a week, you know, you're not fooling yourself, you're not fooling your landlord, you're setting yourself up for a disaster. So many people feel pressured that, look, if I just sign this thing, this creepy person will go away and I can figure out tomorrow what I'm going to do. Tomorrow comes pretty quickly. And a lot of times when somebody's pressuring you to do something, the smarter thing is to just close the door and, you know, I'll deal with this in the proper legal forum. And I know that those board hearings and the whole paperwork and the process is intimidating, but, you know, I don't know what kind of market people are going to be facing out there. You know, how possible it's going to be go around looking at apartments, no matter how willing you are to go and be cooperative. What's out there? How are you going to be able to get a place to live? And can things be done electronically and remotely, or we'll have to see. But I mean, you know, don't give up. Don't feel that it's your failure. And, you know, people have to stand up for themselves, stand up for their clients, even if the clients have got themselves into messes. They still have they have the right to housing just like everybody else does, and them being forced out into homelessness, into, you know, overcrowded shelters is putting all of us at risk. And, you know, until we get clear of this pandemic, we have to worry about everybody. And maybe even after that, we should be worrying about everybody.
So Lisa, I just wanted to sort of pull you in here quickly, because another comment that was just made in the chat was about, you know, using a budgeting tool and things like that, kind of speaking to Ken's comments about being realistic about what you can pay, and don't try to fool people. Even if you're only paying, you know, pennies at a time, it's better to be realistic, and you're going to get your situation looked at more effectively. What would be some specific things that you guys help your clients with in terms of very, very concrete, tangible ways to prepare someone for this situation?
Well, I'll actually admit that one of the tools that we have it's not ours. The City of Ottawa and the Housing-Based Case Management Program that they've got from the Homes for Good, that they've got what do they call it? The real budget tool. And so maybe that's something that we can put a link in. It's not ours, but we'll give credit to the city. I think it tries to kind of really let people think about really what are the different things that they have to spend their money on. So that may be a useful tool to have people look at. Not sure if that answers that. We have probably, like in other communities, some good financial assistance or financial budgeting programs that exist, and we will often make referrals and support people through sitting with one of those financial counselors and really kind of working on a realistic, detailed budget. And they also sometimes have, they used to have a loan program as well for people to get out of arrears. So that's something that is available in Ottawa. One thing I was thinking, just to touch on what Ken was saying, you know, for every eviction that we can avoid through this process, it means that one more rent won't go up, right? So if we can keep people in the housing that they've got, we've got to, you know, the rents are just out of control. And so every time somebody loses their housing, it just makes the availability of affordable housing that much worse as well. So there's not only the individual, but the whole housing market and sector kind of relies on us to help people keep their housing.
Interesting point. I actually hadn't even considered that you know, keeping someone from losing their housing prevents a landlord from raising the rent, which keeps our affordable housing intact. Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. So Michelle, before you get to your sort of federal perspective, what kind of thoughts or comments do you have on the things that have been said so far?
I mean, I think that I would leave it to the other experts in the room who work directly with folks right now and are negotiating. I think it's really important. I'll say as a lawyer as well, in this context, it's really important to remember that an eviction process is a legal process, and that there's always moments to intervene. I know when I was doing frontline work, I know I had a lot of clients who would get an eviction notice and just say, I don't know what to do, and feel like they just totally need to give up. And there were also, I think, sometimes support people working with them who would feel also the giving up moment. But it's important to remember that there is a legal process. We do have a landlord-tenant board. There are supports like CIRA, like ACTO's Tenant Duty Council program, where we can have tenants be able to have the legal help that they need and be able to really fight for the rights and work out something collaboratively also with the landlord. So there's always resources that exist, and it's important to remember an eviction process is a legal process, and tenants do fundamentally have some rights in the province.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. So I just want to kind of pull a few ideas that have been brought out throughout together, because one of the things that still strikes me is that I think we often, when we talk, especially in this sector of human services, when we talk about eviction prevention, it's often very heavily weighted on the rights of the tenant being not considered. You know, but Lisa also highlighted that there are situations where sometimes an eviction is necessary. And actually, you know, from my time and experience in working, you know, in the housing first world and everything else, to be honest, sometimes an eviction is a very healthy strategy, but only when it's merited, only when it you know, falls on issues that are real, and that you know, people aren't treating their housing the way that they should. So what I'd like to sort of ask is, how do we create that balance? When we're talking about the right to housing, when we're talking about people having these rights to, even if they're being evicted, for whatever reason they're being evicted, to have their case heard and so forth, how do we make sure that we're balancing both the rights of the tenant as well as the rights of landlords or property managers or so forth? You know, what's the experience that you folks have?
Well, I think we generally agree that people shouldn't be evicted into homelessness, no matter who they are. And so where are the resources that people who can't fit into more conventional housing, where is the housing for them? And what is, you know, that's what's always, you know, disturbing to me. I mean, certainly if somebody's behavior or whatever the behavior is forcing other people out of their homes, then, you know, they're causing evictions themselves, and let's get at the root of it. But, you know, the purely financial concerns, we certainly have seen massive amounts of money being put into small business relief in many other sectors of the economy. So if it's really about money, and ultimately we want to keep this landlord solvent, why don't we just give the money to the landlord at some point? But the behavior things, I think we have to continue to develop the kind of things that Lisa and her colleagues across the province are working on. supportive housing, appropriate housing, but it's the governments have been very reluctant to put the money that's needed into the bricks and mortar and into the support services. And we all need to continue to push for that. So you don't fit in here, but actually there is a place where you can fit in and you can continue to live your life and hopefully improve the path of your life. But the eviction process is not going to solve that. People who have deep-seated problems don't learn a lesson by having somebody come and drag them and their family out of their home. The lesson they learn is bitterness and anger. And so, I mean, I think while I wouldn't say all moves are bad, I think almost all evictions are bad because it's an imposed process, and where we can move people into something more suitable, and sometimes it's seen as rewarding bad behavior, but I don't really think that's the way to look at that. It's a way to look at it, but there's my piece.
Ben, any other thoughts? I'm kind of curious, Michelle, what you think about, what Ken said in terms of governments sort of not being willing to move into that realm of ensuring that those types of housing that are necessary for those folks that don't fit into the typical housing world. From your learnings, what do you think makes governments hesitant to go there?
Yeah, that's a big question. And it's actually a really good segue to talk a little bit about the federal government role, which is a complicated question. So maybe I'll start by introducing myself a little bit. So I'm Michelle Biss. I'm calling in from the traditional Algonquin territory here in Ottawa. I think Lisa and I are both Ottawaers. So I am the project manager of the National Right to Housing Network. So the National Right to Housing Network is a group of over 250 organizations, lived experience experts, and advocates who are all dedicated to the meaningful implementation of the right to housing. I'm so glad that Ken has given us a little bit of an overview of the right to housing because I don't have to. But to give a little bit of context, at the network, we're dedicated to moving along the National Housing Strategy Act, which was passed in 2019 and made a real commitment to make the right to housing live in Canada. And that was primarily through two pieces, through the establishment of a federal housing advocate, as well as a national housing council. And the idea is that when systemic discrimination exists, when we know that there are big systemic issues around violations of the right to housing, there's an opportunity to put forward cases through this alternate format to have the federal housing advocate investigate and then refer those cases to what will be a review panel of the National Housing Council. They then review the case and make recommendations to the minister, probably the Minister of Families, Children, and Social Development. So why I think that this is really important for folks on this call to know is that I believe without a doubt that security of tenure will be the #1 issue that the federal housing advocate will have to address once they're appointed sometime, hopefully this year. The reality is that, though security of tenure, evictions are primarily a provincial or territorial issue, the reality is that all levels of government have an international human rights law obligation to commit to the right to housing. And, there's a level to this discussion where we have to look at this, from an approach of those who are going to be evicted because of arrears, because they've lost their job, the family that is going to be evicted into homelessness, they don't care which jurisdiction of government this falls under. At the end of the day, we all have an obligation to do whatever we can to take the adequate steps that we have to for the right to housing. So really concretely, in terms of the federal government's role, I'll say they have done some pretty fantastic things during COVID. I will definitely give quite a bit of credit. We've seen programs like the Canada Emergency Response Benefit come out to help folks cover arrears. We've seen programs like investments in reaching home, but there is still going to be this huge gap, right? I know Lisa said she hasn't seen it quite yet. Annie said she's feeling like people are starting to feel the push of evictions. And we know, as Ken said, that we're looking at that starting up in about August. So with that in mind, the question remains, what is the role of the federal government? Well, the federal government could actually do a couple of things. One, they could put conditions on the funding that they give provinces and territories to adhere to the right to housing. And that could mean things like strengthening eviction prevention laws and security of tenure. It could mean backtracking on some of the provisions in Bill 184, for example. It could also mean that the federal government could create additional programs like additional rent banks. I think Annie maybe mentioned that there's quite a few municipal programs right now, but I'm hearing from folks across the country that the investments in those rent banks are really quite limited. But there's another area that we could see some federal government involvement. But really, really critically, I think when we see this federal housing advocate come into their position, there will be an incredible opportunity for folks who are on the front lines, who are observing the eviction process as it happens, who are observing which populations in particular are feeling the brunt of those evictions, because I will tell you right now, I suspect that those identities will be intersectional in terms of persons who experience addictions, persons of color, new immigrants. As if we rally together and put together some of those cases and facts and assemble, then there's a real opportunity to use this new right to housing mechanism collaboratively and figure out where it is that the federal government can lead in terms of a significant reform. So I'll land it there. It's a complicated answer, and I'll also put in the chat box for folks who are interested in the right to housing and what it means concretely for the federal government. And in this conversation, we have a great backgrounder on the right to housing. I'll pop it in for folks who are interested.
Thanks, Michelle. And you know, I know we're just slightly over time, but I think it's worthwhile to chat a little bit further if people are able to, because another question that came in the chat, you know, you talked about, you know, there are some great things that have happened, which there are, you know, and with CERB, but at the same time, as Lisa highlighted, CERB has also been a double-edged sword for a lot of folks. And so the question is whether there was CERB or not CERB or other reasons, there literally are people out there who are facing eviction and have no income. And so the question is how do we create a payment plan? How do we help people in preventing an eviction when there is no income? And I know that there's all of these things that we need to be sort of putting pressure in different places on to try to make those things happen. But the reality is if they're not in place yet, what do we do right now, today, or in the meantime, to help people prevent eviction when they have no income or other similar situations? I don't know. Annie, do you have thoughts on that? Anybody?
I mean, I can throw out a couple of thoughts. We've been doing a lot of advocacy with all of our allies for financial support for renters. And I guess we can't, as Ken sort of said, we're not really going to know what happens when this is weighed in front of the landlord and tenant board. It's sort of, I'm not sure, but I think financial support is just needed for tenants who are finding themselves in those positions. And I'm not sure what's in store when the landlord and tenant board starts hearing those cases. I'm not sure if anyone else has sort of more to add.
Anybody else?
I think the point that both Annie and Michelle made about, like, don't give up, you know, I think the first answer to your question is that there are so many unique situations and that people have to be looked at as individuals. What is the fundamental cause of this person's, of the mess that they're in, and try to work from that. I mean, the City of Toronto has started this program called Eviction Prevention in the community, which tries to build on the rent bank idea, but actually assigns a social worker and, gets at some of the bigger problems behind people's immediate problems. So first, remember that these problems are individualized. They have a cause. But I mean, ultimately, if there's no other answer, then I don't have any money. There's nothing I can do about it. And it's not good for anybody to put me out on the street. Go to the landlord and tenant board and say that to the adjudicator. And if, it's up to them, their job is to weigh what kind of consequences for the landlord and the tenant. Ultimately, they're the ones that have to decide. And for people just giving up and taking themselves out of that consideration, I think you're posing the extreme case where, both sides, the landlord and the tenant are talking and trying to get somewhere, but there just aren't enough pieces to add up to a solution. I do think there's not going to be as many of those situations as we fear, but there will be a lot more than we would like. And ultimately, I think they end up in the lap of those adjudicators, and they have to decide based on their personal values and based on the mandate in the legislation to, that relief from eviction is granted where it's appropriate, have to make those decisions. And then we deal with the fallout from there.
Lisa, any final comments in relation to all of that?
I think that we've been successful historically going with our clients who maybe have done things that seem like they should be evicted, but we have been successful going with them to the LTB and supporting them either with the mediator and coming up with some ideas or waiting until it goes to the next step. But we don't give up. We keep on working on the situations with them and being there and talking to them within that context sometimes helps folks kind of reassess how they want to proceed in their housing situation. And so, but sometimes it does get to that state, right? We're at the LTB and things are looking bleak, but we still stick by, and often we can come up with a resolution, which, we will work hard with the client to try and implement and to make that a successful tenancy. So that's what we hope for. Is you're right, take it all the way to the end, walk with them all the way to that point, and if we can work on some solutions even when it seems like a last minute, we still can be successful in those.
Thank you. And so one of the other things that was just brought up was that, is the landlord tenant board going to be behind? Or is it going to be a backlog that's going to prevent people from getting their issues addressed in a timely way?
I think most definitely. I mean, the ombudsman's office was investigating them, and starting in the earlier, in February, we had meetings with ombudsman investigators about what's causing the delay at the landlord tenant board. And now, I mean, one of the weeks in June, I think there were 20 cases scheduled. June 2019, there were 300 cases scheduled. So something's out of whack there that's going to add to the backlog. Bill 184 is going to add a whole new jurisdiction of debt collection onto the landlord and tenant board's back. So, but they've got some idea that by streamlining the process, they're going to be able to zip through that backlog. But I don't know how, the whole reason we have this body is to inject the human element of decision-making in there, and I'm not quite sure how that's going to work. But to the government's credit, to some degree, they are continuing to appoint new members to the landlord and tenant board, trying to get ready. They seem to be training them in conducting remote hearings, and if they could get that done properly, there probably are some economies that could be reached there. But I think they're facing quite a steep hill to climb, and how that's going to impact on individual landlords and tenants who need to have something resolved, it's really hard to say.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Ken. Michelle, do you have any sort of final comments that you would like to make in this, and then anybody else?
Sure, I'll just say it's been such a pleasure to be part of this conversation, and I'll say it's very interesting to be working with such incredible people through the COVID experience. I'm going to call it the COVID experience so far, and seeing a lot of people, especially folks in the service provider level, people who are in shelters, people who are running Housing First programs, really come together for their clients in a pretty spectacular way, as well as a lot of legal advocates pulling a lot of weight. So I think there's a lot of stress. I certainly am feeling the stress, and I think across the country there's a lot of stress as eviction bans lift. There's a lot of anxiety for tenants and a lot of us who are working with those individuals to find solutions. But I think that there's also a real spirit of collaboration and solidarity among folks to figure out this in a way that is, embraces a new approach, maybe a right to housing approach moving forward. So it's been a pleasure to be part of this conversation and to be part of this community.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. So Ken, I think that your phone, it was sort of like in the Academy Awards, when people are supposed to get off the stage, they start playing the music. I think that was telling us all that we need to shut down our webinar for today. I guess wanted to sort of provide a very, very brief summary, which to me, what I'm hearing is that some of the key factors are that, first of all, there's a lot of work to do in terms of ensuring that people understand that no matter what, we have to do what we have to do in order to get the right supports and the right funding and the right types of housing and development and all of those things into place, so that we have that broad array of options for people regardless of their circumstances and complexities, so that we can truly offer a right to housing to people based on having those kinds of things available. Secondly, I guess what I heard is that regardless of that, there are still avenues that can be taken through the Landlord Tenancy Board or other advocacy methods that give people who are facing evictions an opportunity to have their case heard and to potentially have a chance at saving that. And then along with that, I think a key is that, again, if we can save an eviction, we're preventing this problem from compounding over and over and over again. And so really saving evictions at all costs is kind of this message overtone that I'm hearing that's so important, and that we have all of these resources like CIRA and ACTO and programs like Lisa's and Housing First programs who have support people. And I think the key is making sure that your supports are active and engaged and are not stepping back and assuming that it's a lost cause. And considering the reality of each situation so that it can be faced in a very objective manner. With that being said, and with all of the great things, I want to thank all of you for taking the time. It's been really hugely valuable, and I think that this will, be helpful for a lot of folks as we move forward. And again, I want to remind people this is recorded, so we'll be making it available probably at the latest by tomorrow morning. So thank you all again, and thanks for all the people who chimed in and were listening. And I hope that we can connect further down the road on other things. But I appreciate all the work that you all do. You're all fantastic, and you all deserve medals. So keep at it, and enjoy the rest of your day and your week. And we'll see you all again soon.
Thanks, Wally.
Thanks, Wally. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
So, bye, everybody.